The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the downtown office building as Caitlin Clark stepped out of the elevator on the 15th floor. Her heart was beating faster than usual, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Today wasn't just another day in her life. It was the day that would change everything. Her agent, David, greeted her at the door with a warm smile, but she could see the tension in his eyes too. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, going over numbers, discussing possibilities, and weighing options that most 22-year-olds could never imagine facing. The basketball world had been buzzing with rumors for months, and now it all came down to this single meeting. As they walked into the conference room, Caitlin's eyes immediately went to the large wooden table in the center. Two thick folders sat there side by side, looking innocent enough but containing decisions that would shape not just her future, but potentially the entire landscape of women's basketball in America. She had seen similar folders before during her college recruitment, but nothing had ever felt this significant. David pulled out a chair for her, and as she sat down, he began explaining what lay before them. The first folder contained an offer from a European league that had been courting her since her junior year of college. The numbers were impressive, more money than she had ever dreamed of making, a chance to play professionally immediately, and the opportunity to experience life in a different culture. The team had already arranged housing, provided details about endorsement opportunities, and even offered to help her family visit whenever they wanted. But it was the second folder that made her hands tremble slightly as David opened it. Inside was a contract unlike anything that had ever been offered to a female basketball player in the United States. $100 million. The number seemed almost impossible to believe, even seeing it written in black and white on the official letterhead. The offer came from a new professional women's basketball league that was forming specifically to keep top American talent in the country. The league's founders had watched too many of the best female players leave for overseas opportunities, and they were determined to change that reality. They saw Caitlin not just as a player, but as the face of a revolution in women's sports. As David explained the details, Caitlin found her mind wandering back to her childhood in Iowa. She remembered shooting baskets in her driveway for hours, dreaming of playing professionally someday but never imagining that the professional landscape would look anything like this. Growing up, the WNBA seemed like the only option, and even that felt like a long shot for most players. Her phone buzzed with another text message, the 20th one that morning, from family members, friends, and former teammates, all asking about the rumors they had heard. The pressure from the outside world was intense, but it was nothing compared to the pressure she was putting on herself. This wasn't just about her anymore. Every young girl who had ever picked up a basketball would be affected by whatever decision she made in this room. David continued reading through the contract terms, his voice steady and professional, but Caitlin could barely focus on the words. The European offer was straightforward. Good money, immediate playing time, and a chance to build her reputation on an international stage. Plenty of American players had gone that route and found success and fulfillment overseas. But the American contract was something entirely different. It wasn't just about playing basketball. It was about building something from the ground up. The league was promising to invest heavily in marketing, to secure major television deals, and to create an infrastructure that could support women's professional basketball for generations to come. They weren't just offering her money. They were offering her a chance to be part of history. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous. Caitlin had always been competitive, always wanted to win, but this was different. This was about more than winning games. It was about winning the battle for respect and recognition that women's basketball had been fighting for decades. She thought about her college coach, who had always pushed her to think beyond her individual success. He had talked to her about legacy, about using her platform to lift up others, and about the unique position she was in as one of the most recognizable faces in women's basketball. Those conversations felt more relevant now than ever before. The room fell quiet as David finished going through both contracts. The decision was hers to make, and everyone knew it. No one could tell her what was right or wrong. There were valid arguments for both choices. The European option offered security and proven success, while the American option offered the chance to be part of something revolutionary but unproven. Caitlin looked out the window at the city below, watching people go about their daily lives, probably unaware that a decision being made in this conference room could impact the future of women's sports in their country. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but there was also something exciting about it. How many people get the chance to potentially change the trajectory of an entire sport? Her agent gave her space to think, stepping out to make some phone calls, and giving her time alone with the contracts. She picked up each folder again, reading through the fine print, trying to imagine what her life would look like under each scenario. Both options would make her financially secure for life. Both would allow her to continue playing the sport she loved at the highest level, and both came with their own unique opportunities and challenges. But as she sat there in the quiet conference room surrounded by legal documents and financial projections, Caitlin realized that the numbers weren't really what mattered most to her. What mattered was the story she wanted to tell with her career, the impact she wanted to have, and the legacy she wanted to leave behind. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time as one of the most important decisions in the history of women's basketball hung in the balance. Outside, the world continued as normal, but inside that conference room, the future was being written. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday, Caitlin Clark's world had turned completely upside down. What started as whispered rumors in basketball circles had exploded into a full-blown media circus that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. The simple trip to grab coffee that used to be part of her daily routine now required careful planning, and sometimes even a different route to avoid the cameras. Her phone had become practically unusable. Every few minutes, another notification would pop up: reporters requesting interviews, former teammates sharing articles, and friends sending screenshots of social media posts about her situation. The battery died twice as fast as usual because of all the activity, and she had started keeping it on silent just to get some peace. The morning talk shows were the worst part. Caitlin had made the mistake of turning on the television while eating breakfast, only to find herself staring at a panel of sports commentators debating her worth like she was a piece of property. One analyst argued that no female athlete deserved that kind of money, while another countered that her popularity proved women's sports were finally ready for this level of investment. She watched in uncomfortable silence as strangers discussed her personal life, her career choices, and even her family background. Social media had become a battlefield. Her Instagram mentions were flooded with thousands of comments from people she had never met, all feeling entitled to share their opinions about what she should do. Some fans begged her to stay in America, claiming she owed it to young girls everywhere to be a role model. Others criticized the entire situation, arguing that the money would be better spent elsewhere. The negativity was overwhelming, and she found herself scrolling through comment after comment, each one adding to the pressure she already felt. But it wasn't just random strangers weighing in. Some of the biggest names in women's basketball had started speaking out publicly about her decision. During a post-game interview, one of her childhood heroes had looked directly into the camera and talked about the responsibility that came with being in Caitlin's position. The veteran player had spoken about the generations of female athletes who had paved the way, often for very little money, and how this contract could change everything for future players. Another legend of the game had written an entire article for a major sports magazine, outlining why staying in America was crucial for the growth of women's basketball. She had read every word multiple times, feeling the weight of expectation with each paragraph. These weren't just opinions from random people on the internet. These were voices she had always respected and admired, and they were all looking to her to make the right choice. The pressure wasn't just coming from the basketball world either. Women's rights activists had started using her situation as a talking point about equal pay in sports. Business leaders were discussing the economic implications of her contract on television news programs. Even politicians had begun mentioning her name in speeches about supporting women's athletics. Suddenly, her personal career decision had become a symbol for much larger societal issues. At home, things weren't much calmer. Her family's house in Iowa had become a gathering place for relatives and close friends who all wanted to share their thoughts about the situation. The kitchen table where she had done homework as a kid was now covered with newspapers and printed articles about her contract negotiations. Every meal turned into a strategy session, with family members debating the pros and cons of each option. Her father, who had always been her biggest supporter, was trying to stay neutral, but she could see the worry in his eyes every time someone mentioned the overseas option. The thought of his daughter living thousands of miles away, playing in a foreign country, clearly bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He kept asking practical questions about things like healthcare, housing, and what would happen if she got injured abroad. Her mother approached the situation differently, focusing on the bigger picture and the impact her decision could have on other young women. She had been following the social media conversations closely and would often share comments from mothers of young basketball players, thanking Caitlin for being such a positive influence on their daughters. The responsibility of being a role model had never felt heavier. Her younger brother, who was still in high school and played basketball himself, was probably the most honest about his feelings. He didn't care about the money or the politics, he just wanted his sister to be happy and successful. But even he was feeling the pressure from his classmates and teammates, who constantly asked him what Caitlin was going to do. Every day, at school had become an informal press conference where he was expected to have inside information about her decision. The late-night conversations were the hardest part. After the extended family had gone home and the phone calls had finally stopped, Caitlin would find herself sitting with her parents in the living room, talking through the same questions over and over again. What would make her happiest? What would be best for her career? What would she regret not doing? These weren't easy questions to answer, especially when the whole world seemed to be watching and waiting for her response. Sleep had become difficult. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind would race through all the different scenarios and possibilities. She would imagine herself playing in Europe, living in a new city, learning a new language, and building a career far from home. Then she would picture herself as the face of a new American league, carrying the hopes and dreams of an entire generation of female athletes on her shoulders. The strangest part was how the attention had changed her daily routine. Simple activities like going to the gym or meeting friends for lunch now required planning and sometimes even security considerations. Reporters had started showing up at places she was known to frequent, hoping to catch her for an impromptu interview or just a quick quote about her decision. Through it all, the deadline was approaching. The contracts wouldn't wait forever, and every day that passed seemed to increase the intensity of the speculation and commentary. Caitlin knew that whatever decision she made would be scrutinized and analyzed for years to come. But the pressure of making the right choice was starting to feel impossible to bear. Behind the scenes, while the world debated and speculated about Caitlin Clark's future, a different kind of drama was unfolding in boardrooms and conference calls across the country. The people responsible for making this historic contract a reality were working around the clock, fighting battles that the public never saw, and solving problems that seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The new league's headquarters had become a war room. Executives who usually went home to their families for dinner were now sleeping on office couches, surviving on coffee and takeout food while they restructured deals that had taken months to negotiate. The pressure was enormous, because everyone knew that if they couldn't make the numbers work, they would lose not just Caitlin, but potentially their entire vision for the future of women's basketball in America. The biggest challenge was the television deal. Major networks had been reluctant to invest heavily in women's basketball for years, claiming that the audience just wasn't there to justify the cost. But Caitlin's popularity had changed the conversation completely. Suddenly, the same executives who had passed on women's basketball deals were calling back, wanting to be part of what everyone was calling a potential game changer for the sport. The negotiations were intense. Network representatives would fly in for meetings that lasted 12 hours or more, going through viewing figures, demographic data, and projected advertising revenue line by line. The league's media team had prepared presentations showing how Caitlin's college games had broken viewership records, how her social media following compared to male athletes, and how her marketability could translate into television gold. But the networks wanted guarantees that the league couldn't necessarily provide. They wanted assurance that other star players would join, that the quality of play would be high enough to maintain viewer interest, and that the league would survive beyond just Caitlin's career. These were fair concerns, But they made the negotiations incredibly complicated. Meanwhile, Caitlin's agent was fielding calls from some of the biggest brands in the world. Companies that had never shown serious interest in women's basketball were suddenly wanting to discuss endorsement deals. Nike and Adidas were in a bidding war that went far beyond anything the women's basketball world had ever seen. Shoe companies were offering deals that included signature products, marketing campaigns, and partnership opportunities that would extend well beyond her playing career. The complexity of these endorsement negotiations was staggering. Each company wanted exclusive rights to different aspects of her image and likeness. Some wanted her for basketball-related products, others for lifestyle brands, and still others for their athletic wear lines. The legal teams were working overtime to make sure that all these different deals could coexist without creating conflicts or limiting her future opportunities. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, new complications emerged. Other professional leagues, both in America and overseas, started making counteroffers. A European league that had been quietly watching the situation suddenly came forward with an offer that included not just a higher salary, but also partial ownership in the team. Another American league that had been struggling financially saw an opportunity to steal the deal and made their own pitch. These unexpected developments sent shockwaves through the negotiations. The original league had to go back to their investors and television partners to explain why they might need to increase their offer. Board meetings that had been scheduled for an hour stretched into the evening as financial projections were recalculated and risk assessments were updated. The salary cap implications were another headache that no one had fully anticipated. If Caitlin's contract was as large as rumored, it would affect how much money was available for other players. The league had to figure out how to structure the deal in a way that wouldn't create resentment among other athletes or make it impossible to build competitive teams around her. Some creative solutions emerged from these discussions. The league proposed a revenue-sharing model that would give Caitlin a percentage of television revenue, merchandise sales, and ticket sales rather than just a flat salary. This would tie her compensation directly to the league's success, giving her incentive to help promote and grow the sport while also managing the immediate financial impact on the salary cap. The logistics were mind-boggling. Lawyers were drafting contracts that had never been written before in women's sports. Financial advisors were creating investment strategies for money that no female basketball player had ever earned. Insurance companies were calculating policies for a contract that broke all existing precedents. Every few hours, it seemed like another issue would emerge that threatened to derail the entire process. Questions about international play, Olympic participation, and injury clauses all had to be addressed. The league wanted to protect their investment, while Caitlin's representatives wanted to preserve her flexibility and earning potential. The pressure on everyone involved was enormous. Phone calls were happening at all hours as people tried to coordinate across different time zones and schedules. Assistants were booking flights for last-minute meetings, conference rooms were reserved around the clock, and coffee shops near the league offices were running out of supplies because of all the informal meetings happening there. As the deadline approached, the stress levels reached a breaking point. People who had been working together professionally for years were starting to snap at each other over minor details. The financial stakes were so high that every decision felt like it could make or break the entire deal. But somehow, through all the chaos and complexity, progress was being made. Television contracts were being finalized, endorsement deals were being structured, and the framework for a historic agreement was taking shape. The people working behind the scenes knew that they weren't just negotiating a contract. They were potentially creating a new blueprint for how women's professional sports could operate in America. Late at night, when the offices were finally quiet and the phones stopped ringing, the exhausted negotiators would sometimes pause to consider the magnitude of what they were trying to accomplish. They were attempting to create something that had never existed before, to prove that women's basketball could be a major commercial success, and to provide a foundation for future generations of female athletes. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but so was the excitement. Everyone involved knew that if they could pull this off, they would be part of sports history. The long hours, the stress, and the seemingly impossible challenges would all be worth it if they could create a deal that would change women's basketball forever. The morning of the signing felt different from any other day in Caitlin Clark's life. She woke up before her alarm, her mind already racing with thoughts about what this day would mean. After weeks of sleepless nights, endless discussions, and constant pressure from every direction, the moment had finally arrived. Today, she would officially become the highest-paid female team sport athlete in history. Getting ready that morning was surreal. Every simple action felt weighted with significance. Brushing her teeth, choosing what to wear, eating breakfast. Everything seemed to carry extra meaning because she knew this was the last morning she would wake up as just a college basketball star. By evening, she would be something entirely different. Her mother had been up early too, quietly making coffee in the kitchen and trying to act like this was just another day. But Caitlin could see the emotion in her eyes. This was the daughter she had driven to countless practices, the little girl who used to shoot baskets in their driveway until it was too dark to see. Now that same daughter was about to sign a contract that would change not just her life, but potentially the entire landscape of women's sports. The drive to Indianapolis was quiet. Her father kept the radio off and they traveled in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Caitlin stared out the window at the familiar Indiana countryside, thinking about all the times she had driven these same roads to basketball games, tournaments, and camps. Everything looked the same, but she knew that after today, nothing would ever be the same again. When they arrived at the league headquarters, the scene was unlike anything she had ever experienced. News vans lined the street. Reporters stood behind barriers, and photographers were positioned at every possible angle. The building's lobby, which she had visited just a few weeks earlier for quiet meetings, was now filled with camera crews, league officials, and what seemed like hundreds of people all there to witness this historic moment. Security guards escorted them through a back entrance to avoid the chaos, but even inside the building, the energy was electric. Staff members who had worked tirelessly to make this day possible were smiling and congratulating each other. Everyone seemed to understand that they were part of something special, something that would be remembered for years to come. The conference room had been transformed for the occasion. What had once been a simple meeting space was now set up like a small theater, with cameras positioned at multiple angles and professional lighting that made everything look crisp and official. A large banner with the league's logo hung behind the signing table, and Caitlin couldn't help but smile when she saw her college jersey number prominently displayed. As she walked into the room, the crowd of executives, reporters, and photographers fell silent for a moment. Then came the applause, genuine, enthusiastic clapping from people who had worked months to make this moment possible. Caitlin felt her cheeks flush with emotion as she realized that all these people had believed in her enough to literally bet their careers on her success. The league's commissioner, a woman who had spent decades fighting for opportunities in sports, stepped forward to greet her. The handshake they shared wasn't just a greeting. It was a passing of the torch from one generation of female athletes to the next. The commissioner's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she whispered, "Thank you for believing in us." Taking her seat at the polished wooden table, Caitlin looked down at the contract that lay before her. The document was thicker than she had expected, filled with legal language and clauses that her agent had explained dozens of times. But seeing it there, official and real, made her heart pound with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Her agent sat beside her, quietly reviewing the final details one more time. Even though they had gone over every clause, every number, and every condition countless times, he wanted to make absolutely sure everything was perfect. This wasn't the kind of contract where mistakes could be easily fixed later. Too much was riding on getting every detail right. The signing itself happened quickly, but Caitlin tried to slow down the moment in her mind. As she picked up the pen, she thought about every person who had helped her get to this point. Her first youth coach, who had seen potential in a skinny kid who just loved to shoot. Her high school teammates who had pushed her to be better every day. Her college coach who had taught her that basketball was about more than just individual success. She thought about the girls who would watch this moment on television and maybe pick up a basketball for the first time. She thought about the young women currently playing in college who would now have a completely different set of possibilities for their future careers. She thought about the mothers and fathers who had spent years driving their daughters to practices and games, wondering if their investment in their child's athletic dreams would ever pay off. The pen felt heavier than it should have as she signed her name across the signature line. Each letter seemed to take forever to write, but finally it was done. Caitlin Clark had officially signed the most lucrative contract in women's team sports history. The room erupted in applause again, this time even louder and more sustained than before. Camera flashes went off constantly, capturing every angle of this historic moment. The commissioner stepped back to the microphone to make the official announcement, her voice strong and clear as she declared that this contract represented a new era for women's professional basketball. But for Caitlin, the most meaningful moment came when she looked up and saw her parents' faces in the crowd. Her father was trying to hide his tears while her mother was openly crying with joy and pride. These were the people who had sacrificed so much to help her chase her dreams, and now they were watching those dreams come true in a way that none of them had ever imagined possible. The press conference that followed was a blur of questions, answers, and photographs. Reporters wanted to know how it felt to make history, what her goals were for the league, and what this contract meant for the future of women's sports. Caitlin answered each question as honestly as she could, trying to balance her personal excitement with the responsibility she felt to represent something bigger than herself. As the formal events wound down and the crowds began to disperse, Caitlin finally had a quiet moment to process what had just happened. She was now officially a professional athlete, with a contract that would provide financial security for the rest of her life and the opportunity to help build something completely new in women's sports. The weight of expectation was enormous, but so was the excitement about what came next. The impact of Caitlin Clark's contract signing hit the sports world like a lightning bolt. Within minutes of the announcement, social media exploded with reactions from every corner of the globe. The hashtag about her signing was trending worldwide before the press conference had even ended, and the ripple effects were already beginning to spread far beyond basketball. At the league's ticket office, phones started ringing nonstop. Season ticket packages that had been sitting unsold for weeks were suddenly flying off the virtual shelves. The website crashed twice in the first hour due to overwhelming traffic, and the IT team had to work frantically to keep up with demand. Games that the league had worried might play to half-empty arenas were now selling out in minutes. The most shocking moment came when the league announced that their season opener had sold out in just 4 minutes. 4 minutes. For a women's basketball game in a sport that had struggled for decades to fill seats. The ticket office manager, who had been working in sports for 20 years, said she had never seen anything like it. People were buying tickets to games in cities they had never visited, just to be part of what everyone was calling a revolution. Television executives who had been hesitant about women's basketball just days earlier were now scrambling to secure broadcasting rights. The same networks that had passed on the league's initial proposals were calling back with offers that exceeded even the league's most optimistic projections. Cable networks that had never shown women's basketball were suddenly interested in carrying games. Streaming services were reaching out about exclusive content deals. The transformation was happening so fast it was almost hard to believe. One network executive admitted to reporters that they had completely underestimated the appetite for women's basketball. The viewing numbers for the press conference announcing Caitlin's signing had broken records for women's sports coverage. More people had watched her contract signing than had watched some major men's basketball games the previous season. But the impact wasn't just limited to professional sports. College basketball programs across the country started reporting increased interest from potential recruits. High school coaches were calling to say that girls who had never shown interest in basketball were suddenly asking about joining their teams. Youth leagues were seeing registration spikes that they had never experienced before. One high school coach in Ohio told reporters that 3 girls had approached her after seeing the contract announcement, asking if it was too late to try out for the team. These weren't athletes who had been playing for years. They were students who had watched Caitlin's press conference and suddenly realized that basketball could offer opportunities they had never imagined possible. The equipment manufacturers, were scrambling to keep up with demand. Basketball sales spiked dramatically in the weeks following the announcement. Sporting goods stores reported that they couldn't keep basketballs, hoops, and training equipment in stock. Parents were calling stores asking about youth basketball programs for their daughters, many of whom had never expressed interest in sports before. But perhaps the most powerful impact was happening in living rooms and playgrounds across America. Videos started appearing on social media of young girls practicing basketball moves they had seen Caitlin perform in college. Parents posted clips of their daughters shooting baskets in driveways, talking about their dreams of playing professionally someday. For the first time in many families, those dreams didn't seem impossible. The financial implications were staggering. Major corporations that had never invested in women's sports were suddenly reaching out about sponsorship opportunities. Companies that had allocated tiny budgets for women's basketball were scrambling to increase their investment. Marketing departments that had ignored the sport for years were now studying how they could connect with what was clearly a passionate and growing fan base. Nike announced that they were fast-tracking the production of Caitlin's signature shoe, something that had never been done for a women's basketball player straight out of college. The pre-orders for a shoe that didn't even exist yet broke company records. Other athletic brands were rushing to sign deals with women's basketball players, realizing they had been missing out on a huge market opportunity. The international reaction was just as impressive. European basketball leagues, which had been the destination for most top American female players, suddenly found themselves competing for talent in a way they never had before. Players who had already committed to overseas teams were reconsidering their decisions. Agents were fielding calls from American players abroad, asking if they could break their contracts to return home. Media coverage of women's basketball increased by over 400% in the month following Caitlin's signing. Sports websites that had barely mentioned women's basketball were suddenly publishing daily articles about the league. Television shows that had never featured female athletes were inviting players for interviews. The sport was getting a level of attention and respect that veteran players said they had been dreaming of for their entire careers. The impact on young athletes was perhaps the most meaningful change of all. College players who had been preparing for careers overseas suddenly had a new option to consider. High school seniors who had been unsure about their future were now seeing a clear path to professional success without leaving the country. Youth. Basketball programs were reporting increased enrollment from girls who wanted to follow in Caitlin's footsteps. Parents who had been hesitant to invest time and money in their daughters' basketball careers were suddenly more supportive. The sport had gained legitimacy in a way that changed family dinner conversations across America. Fathers who had focused on their sons' athletic development were now equally invested in their daughters' basketball dreams. Even the academic world took notice. Sports management programs at universities reported increased interest from students who wanted to work in women's professional sports. Business schools started developing case studies around Caitlin's contract, using it as an example of how to build value in an undervalued market. The ripple effects extended beyond sports into broader conversations about gender equality and opportunity. Caitlin's contract became a talking point for discussions about equal pay, investment in women's athletics, and the economic potential of markets that had been overlooked for too long. As Caitlin prepared for her first professional training camp, she was almost overwhelmed by the response to her decision. The weight of expectation was enormous, but so was the support from fans, fellow athletes, and people who believed in what she represented. Every day brought new evidence that her choice to stay in America and help build something new had already begun to change the landscape of women's sports. The revolution in women's basketball had officially begun, and Caitlin Clark was at the center of it all.